Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Earl had been driving through the Appalachian Mountains for nearly 12 years, but he'd never seen rain like this. The windshield wipers on his Peterbilt were working overtime, slapping back and forth in a frantic rhythm that barely kept up with the downpour. Water was cascading down the mountainsides like 1,000 waterfalls, turning the narrow West Virginia highway into something that looked more like a river than a road. He'd left Charleston that morning with a load of construction equipment headed for a job site in Beckley. What should have been a straightforward 4-hour drive had already stretched into 6, and Earl was starting to wonder if he should have waited out the storm. The radio had been crackling with weather warnings all day, but like most truckers, Earl figured he could push through anything Mother Nature threw at him. The road ahead curved sharply to the left, hugging the side of the mountain like a narrow ledge. Earl downshifted and took the turn slow, his headlights cutting through the rain and mist. That's when he saw it. The entire roadway was blocked by a massive pile of mud, rocks, and uprooted trees. A landslide had completely severed the highway, leaving no way forward and barely enough room to turn around. Earl pulled the truck as far to the right as he could manage and set the parking brake. He sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the roof of his cab and considering his options. His CB radio was nothing but static, and his cell phone showed no signal bars. He was completely cut off from the outside world, stuck on a mountain road with nowhere to go. He grabbed his rain slicker from behind the seat and stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately tried to knock him sideways, and the rain felt like cold needles against his face. Earl walked toward the landslide, trying to assess how bad the damage really was. Rocks the size of washing machines had tumbled down from the mountainside, mixed with enough mud and debris to fill a dozen dump trucks. As he stood there getting soaked, Earl heard something that made him pause. It sounded like voices, but that was impossible. Who would be out here in weather like this? He strained to listen over the roar of the rain and wind, and there it was again. Definitely voices, and they seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond the landslide. Earl cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted as loud as he could. "Hello? Is somebody there?" His voice was immediately swallowed by the storm, but he thought he heard a response. He tried again, louder this time. "I'm stuck back here. My truck can't get through." This time, the response was clearer. A man's voice, rough and gravelly, calling back from the other side of the debris pile. "We hear you, mister. Don't you worry none. We'll get you sorted out." Relief washed over Earl like a warm wave. If there were people on the other side, maybe they had equipment that could clear at least part of the slide, or maybe they knew another way around. Earl had never been so happy to hear another human voice in his life. He waited by the landslide for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 15 minutes. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and Earl was soaked through despite his rain gear. He was starting to think about heading back to his truck when he heard the sound of an engine approaching from the other side of the slide. "You still there, trucker?" The same gravelly voice called out. "Yeah, I'm here," Earl shouted back. "You got something that can move this mess?" "Working on it," came the reply. "You just sit tight. We'll have you out of there in no time." Earl heard the sound of machinery starting up, then the grinding noise of something heavy being moved. Rocks began tumbling down from the top of the debris pile, and slowly, a narrow gap began to appear. It wasn't much, but it might be wide enough for a person to squeeze through. After another 20 minutes of work, a man emerged from the gap in the slide. He was tall and lean, wearing mud-covered overalls and a soaked baseball cap. His face was weathered and lined, like someone who'd spent his whole life working outdoors. He had pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through Earl, and when he smiled, Earl noticed that several of his teeth were missing. "Name's Ezra," the man said, extending a muddy hand. "You picked a hell of a night to be driving through these mountains." Earl shook the offered hand, grateful for any human contact. "Earl, I'm just trying to get to Beckley with this load. Didn't expect to run into anything like this." Ezra nodded and glanced back at Earl's truck. "That's a mighty big rig you got there. I don't think we're going to be able to clear enough of this slide for you to get through. Not tonight anyway. But don't you worry. My wife Mabel and I, we live just down the mountain a piece. You can ride out the storm with us and we'll get the county road crew up here first thing in the morning." Earl hesitated. He didn't like the idea of abandoning his truck, even for one night. The load he was carrying was worth more than he made in 6 months, and his company wouldn't be happy if anything happened to it. But what choice did he have? He couldn't stay in the cab all night in this weather, and there was no telling when the storm would break. "I appreciate the offer," Earl said, "but I can't just leave my truck. Company policy." Ezra's smile never wavered, but something changed in his pale eyes. "Oh, I understand completely. But you see, Earl, there's more bad weather coming. Radio says this storm's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. You stay up here tonight. You might not make it till morning." The way Ezra said it sent a chill down Earl's spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. There was something in the man's tone that suggested he knew things Earl didn't, and not all of them were good. "Besides," Ezra continued, "your truck ain't going nowhere. Roads blocked both ways now. Another slide came down about a mile back while we were working on this one. You're trapped up here either way." Earl felt his heart sink. If the road was blocked in both directions, he really was stuck. He looked back at his truck sitting alone in the rain like a stranded whale, then at Ezra's expectant face. "All right," Earl said finally. "I guess I don't have much choice. But I need to radio my dispatcher first. Let them know what's happening." "Radio won't work up here," Ezra said quickly. "Mountains block the signal. But don't worry about that now. We'll get you somewhere warm and dry, get some food in you. Everything else can wait till morning." Earl grabbed what he needed from his truck, his wallet, his overnight bag, and a flashlight. He locked up the cab and followed Ezra through the gap in the landslide. On the other side, a rusty pickup truck was waiting with the engine running. Another person sat behind the wheel, but Earl couldn't make out much in the darkness and rain. "That's my Mabel," Ezra said as they approached the truck. "She's been worried sick about you sitting up here in this weather." Earl climbed into the passenger seat and got his first good look at Mabel. She was a small woman, probably in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a faded flower print dress that looked like it belonged in another century, and when she smiled at Earl, he noticed that her teeth were in even worse shape than her husband's. "You poor thing," Mabel said, in a voice that sounded like she'd been smoking cigarettes for 50 years. "Out here all alone in this terrible storm. We're going to take real good care of you, honey." Something about the way she said it made Earl's skin crawl, but he forced himself to smile and thank her. These people were trying to help him, even if they were a little odd. Mountain folk had their own ways, and Earl had met plenty of eccentric characters in his years on the road. The ride down the mountain was harrowing. The narrow road was more like a glorified dirt path, winding back and forth through thick woods that seemed to press in from all sides. Mabel drove like she'd been navigating these roads her whole life, taking turns that Earl wouldn't have attempted in broad daylight. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the rain and mist, creating an eerie tunnel of light through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, they pulled up in front of a small cabin tucked back among the trees. It was a ramshackle structure that looked like it had been built sometime around the Great Depression, and hadn't seen much maintenance since. The porch sagged under the weight of accumulated junk, and several windows were boarded up with plywood. But there was warm light glowing from inside, and smoke rising from the chimney. "Home sweet home," Ezra said as they climbed out of the truck. "It ain't much, but it's dry." Earl followed them up the creaky porch steps, dodging around rusted farm equipment and stacks of moldy newspapers. Mabel held the front door open for him, and he stepped inside to find himself in a living room that looked like a museum exhibit from the 1940s. The furniture was all mismatched antiques, covered in doilies and antimacassars. The walls were decorated with old family photographs in tarnished frames, and religious paintings that seemed to stare down at Earl with disapproving eyes. A wood-burning stove in the corner provided the only heat, and the air smelled of wood smoke, old cooking grease, and something else Earl couldn't quite identify. "You just make yourself comfortable," Mabel said, bustling around the room like a nervous bird. "I'll get you something hot to drink. Coffee? Tea? Something a little stronger?" "Coffee would be great," Earl said, settling into an ancient armchair that groaned under his weight. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all, honey." No trouble at all. Mabel disappeared into what Earl assumed was the kitchen, leaving him alone with Ezra. The older man settled into a rocking chair across from Earl and began slowly rocking back and forth, his pale eyes never leaving Earl's face. "So," Ezra said after a long moment of silence, "what brings you through our mountains, Earl? Besides work, I mean." "Just trying to make a living," Earl replied, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under Ezra's intense stare. "Been driving truck for about 12 years now, seen most of the country, but these Appalachian roads are some of the trickiest I've ever dealt with." Ezra nodded slowly. "These mountains don't much like strangers. They got their own ways, their own rules. People who don't respect that sometimes find themselves in situations they can't get out of." There was something ominous in Ezra's tone that made Earl's stomach tighten. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing specific," Ezra said, still rocking. "Just that these old mountains have been here a long time. Longer than any of us. They've seen things come and go, people too." Before Earl could ask what that meant, Mabel returned with a steaming mug of coffee. She handed it to Earl with another of her unsettling smiles, and he took a grateful sip. The coffee was strong and bitter, with an aftertaste he couldn't quite place. "Thank you," Earl said. "This really hits the spot." "I put a little something extra in there," Mabel said with a wink, "just to help you warm up." Earl took another sip and immediately felt a spreading warmth in his chest. Whatever she'd added was certainly doing the trick. Within minutes, Earl felt more relaxed than he had all day. The stress of being stranded seemed to melt away, replaced by a pleasant, drowsy feeling. "That's some good coffee," Earl said, his words coming out slightly slurred. "What did you put in it?" Mabel and Ezra exchanged a quick glance that Earl almost missed. "Just a little mountain medicine," Mabel said. "Family recipe." Earl tried to focus on their faces, but everything seemed to be getting a little blurry around the edges. The warm feeling in his chest was spreading through his whole body, making his arms and legs feel heavy. He tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "I think," Earl said slowly, "I think something's wrong with your coffee." Ezra's rocking had stopped, and his pale eyes were now fixed on Earl with an intensity that was thoroughly alarming. "Nothing wrong with the coffee, Earl. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Earl tried again to stand, but it was like his body wasn't responding to his commands. Whatever they'd given him was some kind of drug, and it was working fast. His vision was starting to tunnel, and sound seemed to be coming from very far away. "What did you do to me?" Earl managed to ask, though the words felt thick and clumsy in his mouth. "Don't fight it," Mabel said, her voice now sounding completely different. Gone was the motherly concern, replaced by something cold and calculating. "It'll be easier if you don't fight it." Earl's last clear thought before the darkness took him was that he should have stayed with his truck. Company policy be damned, at least he would have been safe in his cab. But now he was trapped in this nightmare cabin with these nightmare people, and he had no idea what they wanted with him. When Earl woke up, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was the same unidentifiable odor he'd detected when he first entered the cabin, but now it was much stronger, sweet and cloying, with an underlying note of decay that made his stomach lurch. The second thing he noticed was that he couldn't move. His hands and feet were bound with rope, and he was lying on what felt like a bare, wooden floor. His head was pounding, and his mouth tasted like he'd been chewing on old pennies. Earl forced his eyes open and found himself in a dimly lit basement. The walls were rough stone, and the ceiling was so low he wouldn't have been able to stand upright even if he wasn't tied up. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed electrical cord. But it was what he saw in that weak light that made Earl's blood turn to ice water. The basement was full of clothes, piles and piles of clothes, sorted by type and size. Men's clothes, women's clothes, children's clothes. All of them looked like they'd been worn recently, but their owners were nowhere to be seen. And mixed in with the clothes were other personal items: wallets, purses, jewelry, watches. A child's stuffed animal with one button eye missing. Earl tried to scream, but only a weak croak came out. His throat felt like sandpaper, and he realized he was severely dehydrated. How long had he been unconscious? Hours? Days? Footsteps on the stairs above made Earl freeze. Someone was coming down to the basement, and he had a pretty good idea who it was. He closed his eyes and tried to control his breathing, hoping they would think he was still unconscious. "I know you're awake, Earl." Ezra's voice drifted down from the stairs. No point in pretending. Earl opened his eyes to see Ezra and Mabel standing at the bottom of the stairs. In the dim light of the basement, they looked like completely different people. Gone were the helpful mountain folk who had rescued him from the storm. These two looked like predators who had finally cornered their prey. "What do you want?" Earl croaked, his voice barely audible. "Want?" Mabel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Honey, we already got what we want. We got you." "The storm was just luck," Ezra added, settling into a chair that Earl hadn't noticed before. "But we've been working these mountains for 30 years. Sooner or later, someone always gets stuck up here. Someone always needs our help." Earl's mind was racing, trying to process what they were telling him. "You caused the landslide. Now, that would be something, wouldn't it?" Ezra grinned, showing his broken teeth. "Moving that much rock and mud? But no, Earl, we just take advantage of opportunities when they present themselves. Mother Nature does most of the work for us." "What happened to the others?" Earl asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "All these clothes, all this stuff. Where are the people?" Mabel and Ezra exchanged another look, and Mabel giggled like a schoolgirl. "Oh, honey, you don't really want to know that, do you?" But Earl did know, somewhere deep in his gut. These two had been preying on stranded travelers for decades. Everyone who had the misfortune to need their help ended up in this basement, and they never left. "Please," Earl said, his voice breaking. "I've got a family, a wife and 2 kids. They're expecting me home." "They all got families," Ezra said matter-of-factly. "They all got people expecting them home. But you see, Earl, these mountains don't much care about that. These mountains got their own needs." Earl struggled against the ropes binding his hands, but whoever had tied them knew what they were doing. The more he fought, the tighter they seemed to get. "Save your strength," Mabel advised. "You're going to need it." They left him alone in the basement for what felt like hours. Earl used the time to work at his bonds and explore every inch of the room he could reach. But the ropes held fast, and there was no way out that he could find. The basement had no windows, and the stairs were the only exit. During his exploration, Earl found things that made his situation even more horrifying. In one corner, partially hidden under a pile of women's clothing, he found a driver's license belonging to a man named Robert Chen. According to the license, Robert was from California and would have been about Earl's age. The license had expired 2 years ago. In another corner, Earl found a child's backpack with the name Ashley written on it in fading marker. Inside the backpack were school supplies and a half-finished homework assignment dated 3 months ago. Earl tried not to think about what had happened to Robert and Ashley and all the others whose belongings filled this basement. But as the hours dragged by, it became impossible to think about anything else. When Ezra and Mabel finally returned, they brought supplies. Medical supplies. Ezra carried what looked like a doctor's bag, while Mabel had an armload of towels and a large plastic bucket. "Time to get started," Ezra announced cheerfully, as if he were talking about a home improvement project instead of whatever horror they had planned. "Started on what?" Earl demanded, though part of him didn't want to know. "Well," Mabel said, setting down her supplies and rolling up her sleeves, "we can't just let you go, honey. You've seen too much, and we can't keep you here forever, so we got to make some choices." Earl's blood turned to ice as he began to understand what they were really talking about. "You're going to kill me." "Now, don't think of it like that," Ezra said, opening his medical bag and laying out instruments that Earl tried not to look at too closely. "Think of it as becoming part of the mountain, part of something bigger than yourself. These mountains been taking care of my family for generations," Mabel added. "And we've been taking care of them right back. It's what you might call a mutually beneficial relationship." Earl fought against his bonds with renewed desperation, but it was no use. Whatever they had planned for him, he was powerless to stop it. All he could do was scream, and he did, as loud and as long as his damaged throat would allow. But there was no one to hear him. No one except the mountains themselves. And they had been keeping Ezra and Mabel's secrets for 30 years. The last thing Earl remembered was Mabel's face hovering over him, her eyes bright with an excitement that was absolutely terrifying. "Don't worry, honey," she whispered. "It'll all be over soon." 3 days later, a county road crew found Earl's abandoned truck on the mountain highway. The landslide had been cleared, but there was no sign of the driver. The truck was locked, and Earl's personal belongings were still inside: his wallet, his cell phone, even his overnight bag. The police conducted a thorough search of the area, but they found no trace of Earl anywhere. His disappearance was officially classified as a missing person case, though investigators suspected he had simply walked away from his life for reasons known only to himself. Earl's wife and children never found out what really happened to him. They spent years hoping he would come home, checking every lead and following every tip. But Earl was never coming home. He was part of the mountain now, and somewhere in those ancient hills, in a basement that no map would ever show. Ezra and Mabel were waiting for the next storm, the next landslide, the next stranded traveler who would need their help. Because these mountains had been hungry for a very long time. Floyd had always prided himself on following the rules. 23 years of driving 18-wheelers across the country, and he'd never once gotten a serious citation. He kept his logbooks perfect, his truck maintained, and his loads properly secured. When other drivers would joke about skipping weigh stations or fudging their hours of service, Floyd would just shake his head. The regulations existed for a reason, and he wasn't about to risk his clean record over a few minutes of saved time. That's what made the situation at the Kanawha Valley Way Station so particularly unsettling. Floyd was hauling a load of furniture from a factory in North Carolina to a distribution center in Pittsburgh, taking his usual route through West Virginia. The trip was routine, one he'd made dozens of times before, but this time something felt different from the moment he crossed the state line. The weather had been strange all week, unseasonably warm for late October, with a thick humidity that made everything feel sticky and oppressive. Floyd had been driving with his windows down, trying to catch whatever breeze he could, but the air felt dead and still. Even the radio seemed affected, crackling with static that made it hard to pick up anything clear. It was just past 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night when Floyd saw the familiar signs for the Kanawha Valley Way Station. The facility sat about 2 miles off the main highway, accessible by a long, straight access road that cut through dense woods on both sides. Floyd had stopped here many times over the years, and it was usually a quick, efficient process. Pull onto the scale, wait for the green light, maybe chat with the attendant for a minute or two, then get back on the road. But as Floyd turned onto the access road, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The way station's main sign, which was usually illuminated with bright fluorescent lights, was completely dark. The only light came from a few scattered security lamps that cast long, eerie shadows across the empty facility. Floyd pulled up to the scale house and stopped, waiting for some sign of activity. The building looked deserted, its windows dark and its parking lot empty except for one vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck that was parked off to the side. Floyd sat in his cab for several minutes, engine idling, wondering what he should do. Technically, if a way station was closed, he was supposed to bypass it entirely and continue to the next one. But Floyd had never seen this particular station closed before, not even late at night, and his load was right at the legal weight limit, so he wanted to make sure everything was properly documented before he continued north. After waiting another 5 minutes with no sign of activity, Floyd decided to get out and see if anyone was around. He climbed down from his cab and walked toward the scale house, his footsteps echoing loudly in the still night air. The building was definitely empty, but the front door was standing slightly ajar. Floyd knocked on the doorframe and called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" His voice seemed to disappear into the darkness without any response. He pushed the door open a little wider and peered inside. The scale house was a simple, functional building with just one main room, containing the way station equipment and a small office area. Everything looked normal. The scales were still active, showing green lights, and the computer monitors were still running. But there was no sign of any staff. "Hello?" Floyd called again, louder this time. "Way station attendant?" A voice answered from somewhere behind him, making Floyd jump. "Station's closed, friend." Floyd spun around to see a man emerging from the shadows near the pickup truck. He was tall and thin, wearing a security guard's uniform that looked several sizes too big for his skeletal frame. The man's face was gaunt and deeply lined, and when he smiled, Floyd could see that most of his teeth were either missing or badly decayed. "Oh," Floyd said, trying to recover from his surprise. "I didn't see you there. I was just wondering about getting my load weighed. I'm right at the limit, and I want to make sure I'm legal." The man approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. There was something in his gait that reminded Floyd of a predator stalking its prey, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Name's Otis," the man said, when he got close enough for Floyd to see his face clearly. "I'm the night security here. Like I said, station's closed. Has been since 6 o'clock. But the scales are still active," Floyd pointed out, "and the sign didn't say anything about being closed." Otis's smile widened, showing more of his ruined teeth. "Well, that's because we got ourselves a little situation here tonight. Equipment's been acting up all week. Can't trust the readings." Floyd glanced back at the scale house. Everything looked perfectly normal to him, but he wasn't an expert on weigh station equipment. "Is there another station nearby I could use? I really need to get this load checked." "Nearest one's about 80 miles north," Otis said. "But I'll tell you what. Since you seem like a responsible driver, and since you took the trouble to stop here instead of just blowing past like some of these cowboys do, I might be able to help you out." Something in Otis's tone made Floyd uncomfortable, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. The man seemed friendly enough, even if he did look like he'd been living rough for the past several years. "I'd appreciate that," Floyd said carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," Otis said, rocking back on his heels, "I can't run the official scales like I said, but I got a pretty good eye for weights. Been doing this for 15 years. I could take a look at your rig, give you my professional opinion. If you're legal, you can be on your way. If you're over, well, we'll figure something out." Floyd hesitated. It wasn't exactly proper procedure, but it wasn't like Otis was offering to falsify official documents, and Floyd was pretty confident his load was within limits. He'd been careful when loading, and the shipper had provided a weight certificate. "I guess that would be all right," Floyd said. "But I'll need some kind of documentation. My company requires it." "Oh, sure, Otis said, waving his hand dismissively. "I can write you up something unofficial, just to cover your bases until you get to the next official station." Floyd walked back to his truck, with Otis following close behind. As they approached the trailer, Floyd noticed that Otis was paying more attention to the truck itself than to the load it was carrying. The security guard ran his hands along the sides of the trailer, peered underneath the chassis, and even checked the tires with unusual thoroughness. "Nice rig," Otis commented. "Peterbilt 379, classic model. They don't make them like this anymore." "Thanks," Floyd said. "I've had her for about 8 years now. She's been good to me." Otis continued his inspection, taking much longer than Floyd expected. The man seemed to be memorizing every detail of the truck, from the license plate numbers to the company logos on the doors. When he finally finished, he stood back and nodded approvingly. "Yep, you're good to go," Otis announced. "Load looks fine, truck's in good shape. No problems here," Floyd was surprised. "That's it? You don't want to see my paperwork or anything?" "Nah," Otis said. "Like I told you, I got a good eye for these things. You're obviously a professional driver, not some fly-by-night operation. I trust your judgment." Something about this whole interaction was starting to feel wrong to Floyd. In his 23 years of trucking, he'd never encountered a weigh station attendant who was quite this casual about the rules. Even the friendliest inspectors still went through proper procedures. "Well, I appreciate your time," Floyd said, climbing back into his cab. "If you could just write me that note you mentioned." "Oh, right," Otis said. "Tell you what, why don't you pull over there by the office, and I'll get that paperwork sorted out for you. Won't take but a minute." Floyd hesitated again. Everything in his gut was telling him to just leave, to drive to the next official weigh station and get properly inspected there. But Otis seemed harmless enough, and Floyd had already committed to this course of action. He pulled his truck over to the area Otis had indicated, near the side of the scale house building. The parking spot was somewhat isolated, hidden from the main access road by the building itself. Floyd set his parking brake and waited for Otis to return with the promised documentation. But Otis didn't go into the scale house. Instead, he walked back to his pickup truck and began rummaging around in the bed. Floyd watched through his mirrors, trying to see what the man was doing, but the angle was wrong and the lighting was too poor. After several minutes, Floyd began to get impatient. He climbed down from his cab again and walked toward the pickup truck. "Everything all right over there?" Otis looked up from whatever he was doing and smiled that unsettling smile again. "Just getting my paperwork together. You know how it is with government forms. Everything's got to be just so." Floyd could see that Otis was holding what looked like a clipboard, but he couldn't make out any details in the dim light. The man seemed to be writing something, but his body was positioned in a way that blocked Floyd's view of the paper. "Listen," Floyd said, "I appreciate your help, but I'm running on a tight schedule. If this is going to take much longer, maybe I should just head to the next station." "Oh, no need for that," Otis said quickly. "Almost done here. Just need to verify a few details with you. Standard procedure." Otis approached Floyd with the clipboard in hand. In the weak light from the security lamps, Floyd could see that there was indeed a form of some kind clipped to the board, but the writing was too small and the light too poor for him to read it clearly. "Just need you to confirm some information," Otis said, holding out the clipboard. "Your name, your company, destination, that sort of thing." Floyd took the clipboard and squinted at the form. It looked official enough, with the state of West Virginia seal at the top and various boxes for different types of information, but something about it seemed off. The paper looked old and yellowed, and some of the printed text was faded to the point of being illegible. "This form looks pretty old," Floyd commented. "Budget cuts," Otis said with a shrug. "We make do with what we got. Just fill in what you can." Floyd started to write his name in the first blank space, but the pen Otis had given him wasn't working properly. The ink came out in faint, scratchy lines that were barely visible on the paper. "Got another pen?" Floyd asked. "That's the only one I got," Otis replied. "Just press harder. It'll work." Floyd tried pressing harder, but the pen still barely worked. As he struggled with it, he noticed that Otis had moved closer and was now standing right beside him, close enough that Floyd could smell the man's breath. It was a sour, unpleasant odor that suggested poor dental hygiene and maybe something else Floyd couldn't identify. More importantly, Floyd noticed that Otis was no longer looking at the clipboard. Instead, the man's attention seemed to be focused on Floyd's truck, particularly on the cab area where Floyd kept his personal belongings. "You know," Otis said conversationally, "I don't see many drivers come through here as late as you do. Most of them try to hit the way stations during business hours." "I prefer driving at night," Floyd replied, still struggling with the pen. "Less traffic, cooler temperatures, better for fuel economy." "Makes sense," Otis agreed. "Of course, it can be dangerous too. A lot of things can happen to a driver out here in the middle of nowhere, things that nobody would ever know about." The way Otis said it made Floyd's blood run cold. He looked up from the clipboard to find the security guard staring at him with an expression that was no longer friendly or helpful. There was something predatory in those eyes, something that suggested Otis was evaluating Floyd not as a professional colleague, but as potential prey. "I think I'll just head to the next station," Floyd said, handing the clipboard back to Otis. "This pen really isn't working, and I need proper documentation anyway." Otis didn't take the clipboard. Instead, he stepped even closer to Floyd, close enough that Floyd could feel the man's body heat. "Now, that wouldn't be very smart, friend. See, you came onto state property here. You used our facilities. That makes you subject to our procedures." "What procedures?" Floyd asked, taking a step backward. "I thought you said the station was closed." "Closed to regular operations," Otis clarified. "But not closed to special circumstances. And this here's what you might call a special circumstance." Floyd's instincts were now screaming at him to get away from this man and this place as quickly as possible. He dropped the clipboard and started walking quickly toward his truck. "Where you going, friend?" Otis called after him. "We ain't finished with our business yet." Floyd didn't answer. He climbed into his cab as fast as he could and reached for the ignition key. But as he did, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. Someone was moving around the outside of his truck, and it wasn't just Otis. There were at least 2 other people out there, maybe more. Floyd peered out his driver's side window and saw a woman standing near the front of his truck. She was middle-aged and heavy-set, wearing what looked like a waitress uniform. But like Otis, there was something wrong with her appearance. Her hair was stringy and unkempt, and her face had the same gaunt, predatory look. "That's Ruth," Otis called from somewhere behind the truck. "She works the diner up the road. Come down to see what all the fuss is about." Floyd started his engine and put the truck in gear, but before he could move, Ruth stepped directly in front of the truck and held up her hands. She was smiling the same unsettling smile that Otis had been wearing, and Floyd could see that her teeth were in just as bad shape. "Now, don't be rude," Ruth called out. "Otis here says you need some help with your paperwork. We're just trying to be neighborly." Floyd honked his horn, hoping Ruth would move out of the way. Instead, she stood her ground and beckoned for him to shut off his engine. When Floyd didn't comply, her friendly demeanor began to change. "You're being very impolite," Ruth said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "We don't much care for impolite people around here." Floyd looked in his mirrors and saw that Otis had moved to the back of the trailer and was doing something with the rear doors. Floyd couldn't see exactly what, but it looked like the man was trying to open the trailer's cargo area. That decided it for Floyd. He gunned the engine and aimed straight for Ruth, gambling that she would jump out of the way rather than get run over. His gamble paid off. Ruth dove to the side at the last second, screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. Floyd accelerated toward the access road, but as he did, he heard a loud bang from somewhere behind him. In his mirror, he could see Otis running after the truck, carrying what looked like a tire iron or some other piece of metal. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of Floyd's life. He raced down the access road toward the highway, expecting at any moment to see headlights pursuing him or to hear gunshots ringing out. But apparently, Otis and Ruth weren't prepared for a driver who was willing to simply flee the scene. Floyd didn't slow down until he was back on the main highway and had put several miles between himself and the way station. Only then did he allow himself to think about what had just happened. He'd been set up, that much was clear. The way station hadn't been closed due to equipment problems. Otis and his associates had been using it as some kind of trap for unsuspecting truckers. But what had they wanted? His truck? His cargo? Or something worse? Floyd thought about the way Otis had examined his truck so thoroughly, memorizing details and checking every aspect of the vehicle. And Ruth's appearance had been far too convenient. She'd arrived just as the situation was escalating, as if she'd been waiting nearby for some kind of signal. But what really bothered Floyd was the official nature of their approach. They'd had forms, clipboards, procedures. This wasn't some random roadside robbery. This was an organized operation that had been going on for who knows how long. Floyd drove through the night in a state of high alert, checking his mirrors constantly and jumping at every shadow. He didn't stop until he reached the next official way station, about 60 miles north. This one was properly staffed and well lit, and Floyd had never been so happy to see a legitimate state inspector in his life. The inspection was routine and professional, exactly what Floyd was used to. His load was slightly under the legal limit, his paperwork was in order, and he was cleared to continue within 10 minutes. But as he was preparing to leave, Floyd mentioned his experience at the Kanawha Valley station to the inspector. The inspector's reaction was immediate and alarming. "You stopped at Kanawha Valley tonight? That station's been officially closed for 3 weeks. Equipment failure." Floyd felt his blood turn to ice. Closed? But there was a security guard there. He said they were having problems, but he offered to help me anyway. The inspector's expression grew more serious. "Sir, there's no security contract for that facility. When we close a station, we just lock it up and leave." What did this security guard look like? Floyd described Otis and his unusual behavior, as well as his encounter with Ruth. As he spoke, he could see the inspector growing more and more concerned. "Sir," the inspector said when Floyd finished, "I need you to come inside and file a formal report. What you're describing sounds like someone's been impersonating state officials. That's a federal crime." Floyd spent the next 2 hours giving a detailed statement to state police investigators who had been called to the scene. They told him that this was the first report they'd received of suspicious activity at the Kanawha Valley station, but they would investigate immediately. The investigators also told Floyd something that made his skin crawl. 3 truckers had been reported missing in West Virginia over the past 6 months. All 3 had been driving routes that would have taken them past the Kanawha Valley way station. Floyd never found out what happened with the investigation. He finished his delivery in Pittsburgh and returned home to North Carolina, where he immediately filed a report with his own company's safety department. His dispatcher assured him that they would reroute his future trips to avoid that area of West Virginia entirely. But Floyd couldn't stop thinking about Otis and Ruth and whatever operation they were running at that closed way station. How many other drivers had they encountered? How many had been smart enough to get away, and how many hadn't been so lucky? The questions haunted Floyd for months. Every time he passed a way station at night, he found himself wondering if it was really open or if it was another trap. Every uniformed official who approached his truck was suspect until proven legitimate. Floyd continued driving for several more years before finally retiring, but he never again stopped at a way station after dark. And he never forgot the lesson he'd learned that night in West Virginia. Sometimes the people who offer to help you are the ones you should fear the most. Because in those dark mountains where abandoned government facilities sit empty and unguarded, there are predators who have learned to use the system's own rules against the people it's supposed to protect. And they're always waiting for the next trusting driver to stop and ask for help. Clyde had been watching his fuel gauge drop steadily for the past 50 miles, and now it was riding dangerously close to empty. He'd miscalculated somewhere along the route through eastern Kentucky, or maybe the headwinds had been stronger than he'd anticipated. Either way, he was now facing every trucker's nightmare, running out of diesel in the middle of nowhere. The irony wasn't lost on him. Clyde had been driving for Consolidated Freight for nearly 18 years, and he'd always prided himself on meticulous trip planning. He knew exactly how many miles his Freightliner could go on a full tank, factored in variables like terrain and weather, and always built in a safety margin. But today, something had gone wrong with his calculations. He'd filled up in Lexington that morning, expecting to make it easily to his next planned fuel stop in Bristol, Tennessee. But now, somewhere in the winding mountain roads of southeastern Kentucky. His low fuel warning light was glowing like an angry red eye on his dashboard. Clyde grabbed his CB radio and tried to raise other drivers on Channel 19. Eastbound on 119? Anybody out there know where I can find some diesel? I'm running on fumes here. Static was his only answer. These mountain roads didn't see much truck traffic, and CB signals didn't travel far in the deep hollows between the hills. Clyde was on his own. He pushed the truck a little harder, hoping to squeeze out a few more miles, but the engine was already starting to surge as the fuel system struggled to maintain pressure. Clyde knew he had maybe 10 minutes before the engine would starve completely and leave him stranded on the roadside. That's when he saw the hand-painted sign, Hard Scrabble, population 127, last gas for 40 miles. An arrow pointed down a narrow side road that disappeared into thick woods. Clyde had never heard of Hard Scrabble, and it wasn't marked on any of his maps, but he didn't have much choice. He downshifted and carefully guided his rig down the winding access road. The pavement quickly gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt that was rutted and potholed from years of neglect. Tree branches scraped against the sides of his trailer as the road narrowed, and Clyde began to worry about whether he'd be able to turn around if this led nowhere. After about 2 miles of increasingly rough road, Clyde emerged into a small valley that contained what was optimistically called the town of Hardscrabble. It was a collection of maybe 30 buildings, most of them looking like they'd been built during the Depression and hadn't seen maintenance since. Rusted mobile homes sat next to ramshackle frame houses, and abandoned cars were scattered around like monuments to better times. But there, right in the center of what passed for downtown, was a small gas station. It was an ancient Sinclair station with the old green dinosaur logo faded almost beyond recognition. The pumps looked like they belonged in a museum, and the building itself was listing slightly to one side as if it might collapse at any moment. Clyde pulled up to the diesel pump and shut off his engine, hoping he'd made it in time. The fuel gauge was now showing empty, and the low fuel warning was accompanied by an ominous chiming sound from the truck's computer system. He climbed down from the cab and approached the pump, but immediately ran into a problem. The ancient fuel dispenser had no credit card reader, no modern payment system at all. There was just a mechanical display with tumbling numbers and a handwritten sign that read, "Prepay inside, cash only." Clyde walked toward the station building, his boots crunching on gravel that was mixed with broken glass and old bottle caps. The place had a deserted feel to it, but there was a faded open sign hanging in the window, and he could see movement inside through the grimy glass. The front door was propped open with a cinder block, and Clyde stepped inside to find himself in what felt like a time capsule from the 1950s. The shelves were stocked with dusty cans and packages that looked like they'd been there for decades. A few ancient snack machines hummed in the corner, and the air smelled of motor oil, stale cigarettes, and something else Clyde couldn't quite identify. Behind the counter sat a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the mountains themselves. He was probably in his 60s, with stringy gray hair and skin that was weathered and deeply lined. His clothes were stained with grease and dirt, and when he looked up at Clyde, his eyes had a sharp, calculating look that didn't match his rural appearance. "Help you?" the man asked, his voice carrying the thick accent of deep Appalachia. "I need some diesel," Clyde said. "My truck's running on empty." "How much you charging per gallon?" The man behind the counter smiled, showing teeth that were stained brown with tobacco. "Well, now that depends. How much you need?" Clyde did some quick math in his head. His tanks could hold about 200 gallons total, and they were essentially empty. "I need to fill up both tanks, maybe 180, 190 gallons. The station owner's smile widened. "That's a lot of fuel, friend." Name's Homer, by the way. Homer Jessup. This here's my station. Clyde Morrison. Listen, I'm on a tight schedule. Can you fill me up or not? Homer scratched his chin and appeared to be thinking it over. Oh, I can fill you up all right. Question is whether you can afford it. What's your price? Clyde asked, though he was starting to get a bad feeling about this conversation. Well, Homer said slowly, diesel's been hard to come by lately. Supply chain problems, you know. Government regulations, all kinds of complications. I'm having to charge $8 a gallon just to break even. Clyde felt his stomach drop. $8 a gallon was more than double the normal price, even accounting for the remote location. $8? That's highway robbery. That's the price of doing business in hardscrabble, Homer replied, his tone becoming slightly less friendly. Take it or leave it. Clyde quickly calculated the cost in his head. At $8 a gallon for 180 gallons, he was looking at nearly $1,500 just for fuel. That was more money than he had in his checking account, and it would eat up most of his profit from this load. I don't have that kind of cash, Clyde said. Can you take a credit card? A company fuel card? Homer shook his head. Cash only. Always been cash only. Don't trust them electronic payment systems. Then I can't afford to fill up, Clyde said. How about just enough to get me to the next station? Maybe 20 gallons. Minimum purchase is 50 gallons, Homer said. Station policy. Clyde felt trapped. 50 gallons at $8 each was still $400, which was more than he had in cash. But without fuel, he was stranded here with a load that was due in Tennessee by tomorrow morning. Look, Clyde said, I'm in a real bind here. Is there any way we can work something out? Maybe I could give you my credit card information and you could run it through later? Homer's expression darkened. I told you, I don't deal with credit cards. But maybe we can figure something else out. What you got in that trailer of yours? Electronics, Clyde replied. Computer equipment for a distribution center. It's all sealed and inventoried. Homer mused. Electronics, you say? That might be worth something. Maybe we could work out a trade. Clyde immediately shook his head. I can't do that. The load's insured and bonded. If even one box goes missing, I lose my job and probably face criminal charges. Well then, Homer said with a shrug, I guess you got yourself a problem. No fuel, no money, no trade goods. That's what we call a predicament. As if summoned by some signal Clyde couldn't see, the front door opened and a woman entered the station. She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair and clothes that looked like they'd seen better decades. But there was something sharp and predatory in her eyes that immediately put Clyde on edge. This here's Beulah, Homer said by way of introduction. She runs the local hospitality committee. Beulah looked Clyde up and down like she was appraising livestock. Trucker having some trouble, Homer? Needs fuel but can't pay for it, Homer explained. I was just explaining our payment options. Oh, we got lots of payment options, Beulah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just depends on how creative a man's willing to get. Clyde didn't like where this conversation was heading. What kind of payment options? Well, Beulah said, settling herself against the counter. We're always in need of certain services here in Hardscrabble. Man with a big truck like yours could be real helpful to the community. What kind of services? Clyde asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to know the answer. Homer and Beulah exchanged a look that Clyde found deeply unsettling. Oh, just moving things from place to place, Homer said vaguely. We got some items that need to get to other towns, other states. items that are maybe a little too sensitive for regular shipping companies. Clyde's blood ran cold as he began to understand what they were suggesting. "You want me to smuggle something?" "That's an ugly word," Beulah said. "We prefer to think of it as providing transportation services for specialty cargo." "Absolutely not," Clyde said firmly. "I'm not risking my CDL, my job, and my freedom for a tank of gas. There's got to be another way." Homer's friendly demeanor was rapidly disappearing. "Friend, you rolled into our town with an empty tank and empty pockets. You're asking us to provide you with a valuable commodity, but you don't want to provide anything valuable in return. That ain't how business works." "Look," Clyde said, "let me call my dispatcher. Maybe the company can wire you the money or give you a credit card number over the phone." "Phone's been out for 3 days," Beulah said quickly. Storm knocked down the lines. Clyde pulled out his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal bars. He wasn't surprised. These remote mountain communities often had poor cellular coverage, but the timing seemed awfully convenient. "Well then, let me drive to wherever I can get a signal and make some calls," Clyde said. "I'll come back with cash." "Drive where?" Homer asked. "You already told me your truck's running on empty." "You ain't going nowhere without fuel." Clyde was beginning to feel like a mouse in a trap. These people had clearly done this before. Isolated truckers with no fuel and no options were probably easy targets for whatever scheme they were running. "There's got to be something we can work out," Clyde said desperately. "Some kind of reasonable payment plan or something." Beulah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Honey, we are being reasonable. We're offering you fuel in exchange for a simple favor. You haul one little load for us, and we'll fill your tanks and send you on your way." "What kind of load?" Clyde asked, though every instinct was, deliver your legitimate load on time. Clyde looked around the dingy gas station and tried to think of alternatives. He could abandon his truck and try to walk out of these mountains, but that would mean losing his job and leaving thousands of dollars worth of cargo unprotected. He could try to call the police, but his phone didn't work, and these people claimed their landline was down. He could refuse their offer and hope someone else would come along. But this town was so remote that another vehicle might not pass through for days. "How do I know you'll actually give me fuel if I agree to this?" Clyde asked. "You don't," Beulah said bluntly. "But you know for sure you ain't getting any fuel if you don't agree." Homer reached under the counter and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. It was about the size of a shoebox, but heavier looking, and it was sealed with multiple layers of tape. "This here's your cargo," Homer said. "Take it to a truck stop in Bristol, Tennessee. Ask for a man named Bobby Ray at the fuel desk. Give him this package and tell him it's from Homer in Hardscrabble. He'll give you an envelope in return. You bring that envelope back here, and we'll fill your tanks and give you $100 cash for your trouble." "That's a 4-hour round trip," Clyde protested. "My current load is supposed to be delivered tomorrow morning." "Then you better get moving," Beulah said. Clyde stared at the package, trying to decide what to do. It was obviously something illegal. Nobody went to this much trouble for legitimate cargo. But he was trapped here without fuel, and these people seemed to have all the leverage. "What happens if I get caught with this?" Clyde asked. "You won't," Homer said confidently. "Bobby Ray's been doing business with us for 5 years. Never had a problem." "And if I refuse?" Homer and Beulah exchanged another look. "Well," Homer said slowly, "I suppose you could try walking out of these mountains. Might take you 3 to 4 days to reach a main road, assuming you don't run into any wild animals or get lost in the woods." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clyde was trapped here, and these people knew it. They controlled the only source of fuel for miles, and they were making it clear that cooperation was his only option. Clyde picked up the package, surprised by how heavy it was. Whatever was inside felt dense and solid, definitely not drugs or anything lightweight. Maybe electronics, maybe precious metals. He didn't want to know. "How do I know this isn't a setup?" Clyde asked. "How do I know you're not sending me into some kind of trap?" "You don't," Homer said with a shrug. "But what choice you got?" Clyde tucked the package under his arm and headed for the door, but Beulah's voice stopped him. "One more thing, honey. You got 12 hours to make this delivery and get back here. If you ain't back by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, we're going to assume you decided to keep our property, and we don't much like thieves around here." The threat was clear enough. Clyde nodded and walked out to his truck, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to get out of this situation. He climbed into his cab and sat there for a moment, staring at the mysterious package. He could drive straight to the police with it, but that would mean admitting he'd agreed to transport illegal cargo. He could throw it away somewhere, but then he'd have to come back here empty-handed and face whatever consequences these people had in mind, or he could deliver it as requested and hope that would be the end of his involvement. Clyde made his decision. He started his truck and was relieved to see that he still had enough fuel to make it to Bristol. He'd deliver the package, get whatever was in that return envelope, and then figure out how to get away from these people permanently. But as he drove out of Hardscrabble, Clyde couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. These mountain people had trapped him with his own desperation, and now he was part of whatever criminal enterprise they were running. The package sat on his passenger seat like a ticking bomb, and Clyde found himself checking his mirrors constantly, expecting to see police lights at any moment. He'd spent 18 years building a clean record, and now he was throwing it all away for a tank of diesel fuel. But what really terrified Clyde was the growing realization that this had all been too easy, too convenient. His fuel miscalculation, the remote location, the broken phone lines. Everything seemed designed to trap him in this situation, and that made him wonder how many other drivers had found themselves stranded in Hardscrabble, and what had happened to the ones who hadn't been willing to play along with Homer and Beulah's games. Because something told Clyde that in these isolated mountain communities, people who caused problems had a way of simply disappearing. Vernon had always been religious about his pre-trip inspections. 31 years of hauling freight across the country had taught him that mechanical failures could kill you faster than any other hazard on the road. So, when he walked around his Kenworth that morning in Bluefield, West Virginia, checking every component with the thoroughness of a man whose life depended on it, he paid special attention to the brake system. The air pressure was good, the brake pads looked fine, and there were no signs of fluid leaks or worn components. Vernon had just had the entire brake system serviced 2 weeks ago at a shop in Ohio, and everything was operating exactly as it should. His load was well within legal limits. 40,000 pounds of steel pipe headed for a construction site in Charlotte, North Carolina. The route would take him through some of the most challenging terrain in the eastern United States. From Bluefield, he'd climb up through the West Virginia mountains, then descend the long, winding grades on the Virginia side before finally reaching the North Carolina Piedmont. It was a route Vernon had driven hundreds of times over the years, and he knew every curve, every grade, every potential hazard. Vernon had started driving truck back in 1992, right out of high school. His father had been a driver, and his grandfather before that. It was family tradition, you might say. 3 generations of men who understood that the road was both provider and predator, that it could give you a good living if you respected it, or take your life if you didn't. The morning climb out of Bluefield went smoothly. Vernon's truck pulled strongly up the steep grades, the engine running cool and the transmission shifting smoothly through the gears. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, good visibility, and no wind to speak of. It was the kind of day that made Vernon remember why he'd fallen in love with trucking in the first place. As Vernon climbed higher into the mountains, he passed several other trucks heading in the opposite direction. Most of the drivers gave him a friendly wave or flashed their lights in greeting. It was one of the things Vernon liked best about trucking: the sense of community among drivers, the understanding that they were all in this together. At the summit, Vernon pulled into a scenic overlook to check his load securement and give his brakes a chance to cool down before starting the long descent. The overlook provided a spectacular view of the Virginia mountains rolling away to the east, layer after layer of ridges disappearing into the blue distance. Vernon had seen this view hundreds of times, but it never failed to impress him. Vernon walked around his trailer, checking that the steel pipes hadn't shifted during the climb. Everything looked secure, properly chained and blocked according to DOT regulations. He checked his brake drums by hand. They were warm, but not excessively hot. Exactly what he'd expect after a long climb. The air pressure in his brake system was holding steady at 120 psi, well within normal parameters. Vernon also took a moment to check his engine fluids and tire pressures. Everything looked good. His Kenworth was a 2019 model with only 180,000 miles on it, still relatively new by trucking standards. The company he worked for, Mountain States Freight, maintained their equipment well and insisted on regular preventive maintenance. Satisfied that everything was in order, Vernon climbed back into his cab and began the descent down the eastern side of the mountain. This was where things would get tricky. The road ahead was a series of steep switchbacks that dropped nearly 2,000 feet in elevation over the course of 8 miles. Posted speed limits for trucks dropped to 35 miles per hour, with numerous runaway truck ramps positioned at strategic points along the descent. Vernon had been down this mountain so many times he could practically drive it with his eyes closed. He knew exactly where the steepest grades were, which curves were the trickiest, and where the runaway truck ramps were located. But he also knew that familiarity could be dangerous. It was when drivers got overconfident that accidents happened. Vernon downshifted to 8th gear and settled into a steady 30 miles per hour pace, using his engine brake to control his speed rather than relying heavily on his wheel brakes. This was standard procedure for mountain driving. Let the engine do most of the work, and use the wheel brakes only for minor speed adjustments. The Jake brake on his Kenworth was particularly effective, providing strong engine braking that helped maintain safe speeds on steep grades. Everything was going smoothly for the first 2 miles. Vernon maintained perfect control of his speed, taking each curve with the confidence that came from decades of experience. The truck's Jake brake was working perfectly, providing that characteristic rumbling sound that mountain residents either loved or hated. Vernon had his CB radio tuned to channel 19, listening to other drivers share information about road conditions and traffic. The autumn scenery was spectacular. The trees were at peak color, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds, oranges, and yellows. Vernon had always thought this was the most beautiful time of year to be driving through Appalachia. The air was crisp and clear, with just enough chill to remind you that winter wasn't far away. It was at the 3rd switchback that Vernon first noticed something was wrong. He pressed his brake pedal to make a minor speed adjustment before entering the curve, and the pedal felt different. Instead of the firm, responsive feel he was used to, there was a slight sponginess that shouldn't have been there. Vernon pumped the brake pedal a few times, trying to firm up the system. The air pressure gauge still showed normal readings, but something definitely felt off. His speed was starting to creep up beyond what was safe for the upcoming curve. The speedometer showed 32 miles per hour, then 33, then 34. Vernon downshifted to 7th gear and increased his Jake brake setting to maximum. The engine brake helped slow the truck, but not quite enough. He was still carrying too much speed into the curve, and his trailer was starting to push the tractor sideways with its momentum. The steel pipes in his trailer were heavy, and their weight was becoming a factor in how the truck handled. That's when Vernon pressed the brake pedal hard and felt it sink toward the floor with almost no resistance. His heart jumped into his throat as he realized what was happening. His brake system was failing, and he was only a quarter of the way down the mountain. Vernon's training kicked in immediately. He tried everything he'd been taught to do in this situation. He pumped the brake pedal rapidly, hoping to build up enough pressure for one good stop. He downshifted to 6th gear, then 5th, pushing his engine to the red line to generate maximum braking force. He turned on his 4-way flashers and started looking for somewhere to get off the road. But the mountain offered few options. The road was carved into the side of a steep slope, with a rock wall on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. The guardrail on the right side of the road looked flimsy, certainly not strong enough to stop a fully loaded 18-wheeler, and the runaway truck ramps were still miles ahead. Vernon's speed was increasing with every passing second. The speedometer climbed past 40 miles per hour, then 45. He was now taking curves that were posted for 25 miles per hour at nearly twice the safe speed. The truck's suspension creaked and groaned as the weight of the load shifted in the turns, and Vernon could feel the trailer wheels starting to slide on the pavement. The steering wheel was vibrating in Vernon's hands as the front wheels struggled to maintain traction. He could smell the acrid odor of overheated brake components, even though his brakes were essentially useless at this point. The Jake brake was still working, but it wasn't nearly enough to control the speed of a truck this heavy on such a steep grade. Vernon grabbed his CB radio and keyed the microphone. "Mayday, Mayday. This is eastbound on Route 19, mile marker 47. I've got a runaway truck with brake failure. Somebody call the state police." A voice immediately responded. "I copied that, driver. This is Hiram at the garage in Tazewell. I'm calling 911 right now. How bad is your situation?" "Bad," Vernon replied, fighting to keep the truck centered in his lane as he took another sharp curve. "No brakes, speed building, still got 6 miles of mountain to go." Hiram's voice came back steady and professional. "All right, listen to me. I've been working on trucks for 40 years, and I know that mountain like the back of my hand. There's a runaway ramp at mile marker 42. That's your best shot. You think you can make it that far?" Vernon looked at his speedometer, which was now showing 50 miles per hour and climbing. "I don't know. This thing's getting away from me. You hang in there, driver. Help's on the way. What's your name?" "Vernon. Vernon Blackwood." "All right, Vernon. I'm Hiram Sutton. You just keep talking to me and we'll get you through this. What kind of rig you driving?" "Kenworth T680. 40,000 pounds of steel pipe." "That's a heavy load, but that Kenworth's got good brakes when they're working. Something must have failed catastrophic-like for you to lose them all at once." Vernon focused all his attention on keeping the truck on the road. His engine was screaming at maximum RPM, but it wasn't enough to overcome the force of gravity and momentum. The truck was accelerating like a freight train down the mountain, and every curve was becoming more dangerous than the last. At 55 miles per hour, Vernon felt the trailer wheels break loose on a particularly sharp left-hand turn. The back end of the trailer swung wide, and for a terrifying moment Vernon thought he was going to jackknife. He counter-steered desperately, using every ounce of his experience to bring the rig back under control. The CB crackled with voices as other drivers heard his emergency calls and tried to help. Someone reported that the state police were setting up roadblocks at the bottom of the mountain. Another driver said he was following behind Vernon and would try to stay back and warn other traffic. "Vernon, this is Hiram again. I just talked to the state boys. They're clearing all the traffic off the mountain ahead of you. You got a clear road all the way down." "Thanks, Hiram. But I don't think I'm going to make it to that runaway ramp. This truck's doing 60 now. Don't you give up on me, Vernon. I seen drivers make it out of worse situations than this. You keep fighting that steering wheel and stay focused." But Vernon knew he was running out of time and options. His speed was now approaching 60 miles per hour, and the truck was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The steering felt loose and imprecise, and he could feel the entire rig starting to become unstable. The weight of the steel pipes was causing the trailer to sway back and forth, making the truck even harder to handle. That's when he heard a new voice on the CB. "Runaway truck. This is Opal in the white Honda. I'm about a mile ahead of you and I can see you coming. There's a state police car here and they're clearing traffic out of your way." Thank God, Vernon breathed. At least he wouldn't have to worry about hitting innocent motorists. But he still had to survive the next few miles of descent, and his truck was rapidly approaching the point where it would be completely uncontrollable. Vernon could see another vehicle ahead of him now, the white Honda that Opal had mentioned. It was moving quickly down the mountain, staying well ahead of Vernon's runaway truck. In his mirrors, Vernon could see the flashing lights of what looked like another state police car following behind at a safe distance. Mile marker 44 flashed past, then 43. Vernon could see the runaway truck ramp ahead, a long gravel chute that angled upward from the main roadway. It was designed to safely stop runaway trucks using a combination of loose gravel and an upward slope that would dissipate momentum. But Vernon was traveling much faster than the ramp was designed to handle. At 65 miles per hour, there was no guarantee that even the runaway ramp would be able to stop him safely. And if he missed the ramp entrance, there would be no second chances. The road beyond the ramp was even steeper, with tighter curves and no more emergency exits for miles. Vernon began positioning his truck for the ramp approach, knowing he would have only one shot at this. The entrance was narrow, and at his current speed, even a slight miscalculation would send him careening off the roadway and down the mountainside. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and the vibration of the steering wheel, making precise control even more difficult. The ramp entrance was coming up fast. Vernon could see a state police car parked at the bottom of the ramp, its lights flashing. An officer was standing beside the car, waving his arms to signal Vernon toward the ramp. The man looked impossibly small and vulnerable standing there, and Vernon prayed he wouldn't lose control and endanger him. Vernon could feel sweat running down his face despite the cool mountain air. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the roar of his engine. This was it. Make the ramp or die trying. There were no other options left. At the last possible moment, Vernon cranked the steering wheel hard to the right and aimed for the ramp entrance. The truck hit the gravel at 67 miles per hour, immediately throwing up a massive cloud of dust and debris that obscured everything behind him. Vernon was slammed forward against his seatbelt as the loose gravel began to slow the truck's momentum. But something went wrong. Instead of tracking straight up the ramp as it was designed to do, Vernon's truck began to veer toward the left side. The heavy load of steel pipe was shifting in the trailer, throwing off the truck's balance and steering. The gravel was deeper on one side of the ramp than the other, causing the truck to pull to the left. Vernon fought with the steering wheel, trying to keep the truck centered on the ramp, but it was like trying to steer a runaway freight train. The loose gravel provided some braking action, but not enough, and the truck was heading directly toward the concrete barrier that lined the left side of the ramp. The impact, when it came, was tremendous. Vernon's truck hit the barrier at about 35 miles per hour, causing the entire rig to tip over onto its side. The trailer broke free from the tractor and continued sliding up the ramp on its side, spilling steel pipes in every direction. The pipes rolled and bounced down the mountainside, crashing through trees and creating an avalanche of metal debris. Vernon found himself hanging sideways in his cab, held in place only by his seatbelt. His head was ringing from the impact, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But he was alive, and as far as he could tell, he wasn't seriously injured. The cab of his Kenworth had protected him well, its reinforced structure absorbing most of the impact. The first person to reach Vernon's truck was the state police officer who had been directing him toward the ramp. The man was out of breath from running up the gravel slope, and his face was pale with concern. "Driver, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Vernon called out, though his voice sounded shaky even to himself. "Banged up a little, but okay." "Don't try to move," the officer instructed. "We've got emergency crews on the way." Within minutes, the runaway truck ramp was swarming with emergency vehicles. Firefighters used hydraulic tools to carefully extract Vernon from his overturned cab. Paramedics checked him over thoroughly, but aside from some bruises and a small cut on his forehead, he was remarkably uninjured. As Vernon sat in the back of an ambulance getting his wounds cleaned, he watched the recovery crews work to clear the scattered steel pipes from the runaway ramp. The scene looked like a war zone, with twisted metal and debris scattered across hundreds of yards of gravel. It would take days to clean up the mess, and the ramp would be out of service until then. "You're one lucky son of a gun," said the state police officer who had witnessed the crash. His name tag read Trooper Williams, and he looked like he'd seen his share of mountain accidents over the years. "I've been working this stretch of road for 15 years, and I've never seen anybody walk away from a runaway truck accident like that." Vernon nodded, still trying to process what had happened. "I don't understand it. I checked those brakes this morning. Everything was perfect." "Well, we'll have the DOT investigators take a look at your truck," Williams said. "They'll figure out what went wrong. But right now, the important thing is that you're alive, and nobody else got hurt." It was then that Hiram arrived at the scene. Vernon recognized the voice from the CB radio immediately. A tall, lean man in his 60s wearing grease-stained coveralls and a baseball cap. He introduced himself as the owner of Hiram's Garage in Tazewell, the man who had helped coordinate the emergency response. "Hell of a thing," Hiram said, shaking Vernon's hand. "I've been working on trucks for 40 years and I ain't never seen brakes fail that sudden. Usually, you get some warning. Pedal gets soft, pressure drops gradually. But what you described sounds like a catastrophic failure." "That's exactly what it was," Vernon replied. "One minute everything was fine, the next minute I had no brakes at all." Hiram walked over to examine Vernon's overturned truck, paying particular attention to the brake components that were now accessible due to the truck's position. After several minutes of inspection, he returned with a troubled expression. "Find something?" Trooper Williams asked. "Maybe," Hiram said slowly. "Hard to tell with all this crash damage, but it looks like there might be something wrong with the brake line connections. Could be they were tampered with." Vernon felt a chill run down his spine. "Tampered with? What do you mean?" "I mean, somebody might have loosened your brake line fittings just enough so they'd fail under pressure," Hiram explained. "It's an old trick. Lines hold up fine during normal driving, but when you really need the brakes, the connections blow out and you lose all your fluid." Trooper Williams immediately became more interested. "Are you saying this might not have been an accident?" "I'm saying it's possible," Hiram replied. But like I said, it's hard to tell for sure with all this crash damage. The DOT investigators will have to make the final determination. Vernon's mind was racing. Who would want to sabotage his truck? He couldn't think of any enemies, any disputes, anyone who might want to hurt him. He was just a driver trying to make a living, not involved in anything that would make him a target. "Where did you stop last?" Williams asked. "Anybody have access to your truck overnight?" "I stayed at a truck stop in Beckley last night," Vernon said. "But I was parked right out in the open, and I locked everything up tight." "Still," Williams said, "if someone wanted to mess with your brake lines, a truck stop parking lot would be the perfect place to do it. Lots of trucks coming and going. Nobody pays attention to a guy working under a hood." Vernon tried to remember if he'd noticed anything unusual at the truck stop. Had anyone been paying particular attention to his truck? Had he seen anyone lurking around the parking lot area? But it had been a routine stop, and he'd been tired from a long day of driving. "There was one thing," Vernon said suddenly. "When I was doing my pre-trip inspection this morning, I thought I heard someone walking around near my truck. But when I looked, nobody was there." Hiram and Williams exchanged glances. "What time was this?" Williams asked. "Early, maybe 5:30 in the morning, still dark." "And you didn't see anyone?" "No, but I definitely heard footsteps. Gravel crunching, like someone was trying to walk quietly." Williams wrote this information down in his notebook. "We'll check with the truck stop, see if they've got any security camera footage from last night, and the DOT investigators will give your truck a thorough going over." As the conversation continued, Vernon became aware that someone else had arrived at the accident scene. A woman was standing at the edge of the crowd of emergency responders, watching the proceedings with intense interest. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair and clothes that suggested she was local to the area. What struck Vernon as odd was that she didn't seem surprised or shocked by what she was seeing. Most people who stumbled onto the scene of a major truck accident would be asking questions, trying to understand what had happened. But this woman was just watching, like she was waiting for something. "Who's that?" Vernon asked, nodding toward the woman. Williams and Hiram turned to look. "That's Opal Hensley," Williams said. "Lives up the mountain a ways. She's the one who called in your emergency, helped us coordinate the response." Vernon remembered the voice on the CB radio. "She said she was in a white Honda, that she could see me coming." "Yeah, she was headed down the mountain when she saw you," Williams confirmed. "Lucky thing, too. If she hadn't called ahead to warn us, we might not have been able to clear the traffic in time." Vernon studied Opal Hensley more carefully. There was something about her presence that bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she was watching the investigators examine his truck, like she was particularly interested in what they might find. "Has she said anything about what she saw?" Vernon asked. "Just that she saw a truck coming down the mountain way too fast," Williams replied. "Said she could tell right away that something was wrong." Vernon nodded, but he kept watching Opal. As the investigators worked, she moved closer to get a better view of what they were doing. And when Hiram pointed out the potentially damaged brake lines, Vernon could swear he saw a flash of concern cross her face. It was probably nothing. Vernon was shaken up from the accident, and his imagination was likely running wild. But something about Opal Hensley's behavior struck him as suspicious. The investigation continued for several more hours. The DOT investigators confirmed Hiram's initial assessment. There was evidence that the brake line connections had been tampered with. Someone had deliberately loosened the fittings just enough to cause a catastrophic failure under pressure. "This is now a criminal investigation," Williams announced. "Someone tried to kill you, Mr. Vernon, and they damn near succeeded." Vernon felt sick to his stomach. The idea that someone had deliberately tried to murder him was almost impossible to process. But the evidence was clear. His brake lines had been sabotaged by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "We'll need you to make a detailed statement," Williams continued. "Every stop you made, everyone you talked to, anything unusual you might have noticed." As Vernon began recounting his movements over the past few days, he noticed that Opal Hensley was still hanging around the accident scene. Most of the other bystanders had left, but she remained, listening intently to everything that was being said. When Vernon mentioned the footsteps he'd heard at the truck stop that morning, he saw Opal's head snap up with obvious interest. And when he described the loose feeling in his brake pedal just before the failure, her face went pale. Vernon made a decision. "Trooper Williams, could I speak with Miss Hensley? I'd like to thank her for helping coordinate the emergency response." Williams nodded and called Opal over. She approached reluctantly, and Vernon could see that she was nervous about something. "I wanted to thank you," Vernon said, studying her face carefully. "You probably saved my life by calling ahead." "Just did what anybody would do," Opal replied, but she wouldn't meet Vernon's eyes. "How did you know to look for me?" Vernon asked. "I mean, there must be dozens of trucks that come down this mountain every day." Opal shifted uncomfortably. "I heard you on the CB radio, calling for help. Figured I should let the police know." But Vernon was sure that wasn't the whole story. Something about Opal's manner suggested. Opal stammered, "It all happened so fast." But Vernon wasn't buying it. "You knew my brakes were going to fail, didn't you? You knew because you're the one who sabotaged them." The accusation hit Opal like a physical blow. For a moment, Vernon thought she was going to deny it. But then her shoulders sagged, and he could see the fight go out of her. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Williams immediately stepped forward and began reading Opal her rights. But Vernon needed to know why. Why had this woman he'd never met before tried to kill him? "Why?" Vernon asked. "What did I ever do to you?" Opal looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "It wasn't about you personally. It was about the money." "What money?" "The insurance money. My husband owed some very dangerous people a lot of money. They said if he didn't pay up, they'd kill him. But if there was an accident, if a truck driver died on our mountain road, the insurance companies would have to pay out big settlements, and those people would get a cut." Vernon felt his blood turn to ice. "You're saying you tried to murder me for insurance money?" "I never meant for it to go this far," Opal sobbed. "I was just supposed to loosen your brake lines a little, make it look like an accident. But I must have loosened them too much." The full horror of the situation was starting to sink in. Vernon had almost died not because of any personal enemy, but because he'd been randomly selected as a victim in an insurance fraud scheme. "How many others?" Williams demanded. "How many other drivers have you done this to?" "This was the first time," Opal insisted. "I swear it was the first time." But Williams wasn't convinced. "We'll be investigating every truck accident on this mountain for the past 5 years. If we find out you've done this before, you'll be looking at multiple murder charges." As Williams handcuffed Opal and led her toward his patrol car, Vernon couldn't help but think about how close he'd come to becoming just another statistic. Another truck driver who died in a mountain accident. Another case that would have been written off as mechanical failure. But the thing that really terrified Vernon was the realization that this probably wasn't an isolated incident. If Opal and her associates were running an insurance fraud scheme on this mountain road, how many other accidents had they caused? How many other drivers had died so that criminals could collect insurance money? The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Opal's husband had indeed been involved with organized crime figures who specialized in insurance fraud. They had identified several mountain roads where truck accidents would be believable, and they had been planning to cause multiple accidents over the course of several months. Vernon's case was supposed to be their first victim, a test run to see if their system would work. If it had succeeded, dozens of other drivers might have died in similar accidents on mountain roads throughout Appalachia. The insurance payouts would have been enormous. Each accidental death could generate settlements worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that would be split between the criminals and their inside contacts at various insurance companies. Vernon testified at Opal's trial and at the trials of her co-conspirators. The entire conspiracy was eventually unraveled, with arrests made in 3 states. Several insurance company employees were also charged with fraud for their part in the scheme. But Vernon never forgot the lesson he'd learned that day on the mountain. He'd always known that trucking was a dangerous profession, but he thought the dangers came from mechanical failures, bad weather, and careless drivers. He'd never imagined that there were people who would deliberately try to kill truckers for profit. As Vernon watched Opal being driven away in the back of a police car, he made a silent promise to himself. He would testify at her trial, and he would make sure that every trucking company in the country knew about this mountain road and the predators who hunted there. Because somewhere in these ancient hills, there were people who viewed truck drivers not as human beings, but as opportunities for profit. And they would keep killing until someone stopped them. Vernon continued driving for several more years before finally retiring, but he never again drove through those Virginia mountains without thinking about that day. Every time he saw a runaway truck ramp, he remembered how close he'd come to dying. And every time he heard about a truck accident on a mountain road, he wondered if it was really an accident, or if there were predators involved. The mountains of Appalachia were beautiful, but they could also be deadly, and sometimes the greatest danger came not from the roads themselves, but from the people who lived alongside them. Chester had been driving for nearly 14 hours straight when he finally decided he couldn't push it any further. The load of auto parts he was hauling from Detroit to Atlanta was due tomorrow afternoon, but his eyelids were getting heavy and his reaction time was starting to slow. The smart thing to do was find a place to park for a few hours and grab some sleep before the final push. Chester Dunmore had been a professional driver for 16 years, and he'd learned to recognize the warning signs of fatigue before they became dangerous. The slight burning sensation in his eyes, the way his head would nod forward for just a second before he caught himself, the tendency to drift slightly in his lane. All of these were signals that it was time to pull over. He'd started this run at 6 in the morning, hauling transmission components and brake assemblies for a major automotive manufacturer. The load was worth more than $200,000, and Chester's company, Midwest Transport, had a reputation for on-time delivery that they guarded jealously. But no delivery was worth risking lives, and Chester knew that pushing beyond his limits would be asking for trouble. The problem was finding a decent truck stop in this part of Tennessee. Chester was driving through a particularly remote section of the Cumberland Mountains, where truck stops were few and far between. Most drivers tried to time their trips to avoid stopping in this area overnight, but Chester's delivery schedule hadn't given him much choice. He'd been planning to stop at a Flying J about 50 miles ahead, but the fatigue was hitting him harder than expected. Maybe it was the stress of the tight delivery schedule, or maybe it was the fact that he'd been fighting a mild case of the flu for the past week. Either way, Chester knew he needed to rest soon. That's when he saw the faded sign for Mountain View Truck Plaza, 2 miles. Chester couldn't remember ever stopping there before, but any port in a storm. He took the exit and followed a winding 2-lane road that climbed steadily into the mountains, passing through thick forests that seemed to press in from both sides. The road was in poor condition, with potholes and patches that suggested it hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. Chester had to slow down to avoid damaging his truck on the worst sections. As he climbed higher, the trees grew thicker and the road grew narrower until it felt like he was driving through a tunnel of vegetation. Chester began to have second thoughts about this route. The road was barely wide enough for his 18-wheeler, and there were no places to turn around if the truck stop turned out to be unsuitable. But he was committed now. There was no way to back a full-size rig down this winding mountain road in the dark. The truck stop, when he finally reached it, was not what Chester had expected. Instead of the modern, well-lit facilities he was used to, Mountain View Truck Plaza looked like it had been built sometime in the 1970s and hadn't seen much maintenance since. The main building was a low, rambling structure with faded siding and a few dim lights in the windows. The fuel islands were ancient, and most of the parking spaces were empty. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through the gaps. Several of the light poles had burned out bulbs, creating pools of darkness between scattered islands of weak illumination. Chester could see only two other trucks in the lot: an old Peterbilt that looked like it hadn't moved in months, and a newer Freightliner that was parked so far from the building it was almost invisible in the shadows. But Chester was too tired to be picky. He pulled into one of the parking spots furthest from the main building, set his parking brake, and shut off his engine. The sudden silence was almost eerie after 14 hours of road noise and engine rumble. Chester sat in his cab for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant sounds of the mountain forest. Chester climbed down from his cab and stretched, working the kinks out of his back and shoulders. The mountain air was cool and crisp, a welcome change from the stuffiness of his truck. He could hear night sounds from the surrounding forest: owls hooting, insects chirping, and the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The entire place had an abandoned, forgotten feel to it. Chester wondered how this truck stop stayed in business with so little traffic. Maybe it survived on the occasional stranded driver like himself, people who had no choice but to stop at whatever facility they could find. The truck stop's main building looked like it was still open, though just barely. A few lights were on inside, and Chester could see what looked like a convenience store through the dirty windows. A neon "open" sign flickered weakly in the window, its red letters barely visible through the grime. Chester decided to grab a cup of coffee and maybe a snack before settling in for the night. He locked his truck and walked across the parking lot toward the main building, his boots crunching on the broken asphalt. As he got closer, he could see that the building was in even worse condition than it had appeared from a distance. The front door opened with a jangle of bells that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Inside, the store looked even more dated than the exterior. The shelves were stocked with dusty merchandise that looked like it had been there for years, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows around the room. The floor was covered with cracked linoleum that might have been white at one time, but was now a sickly yellow color. The walls were paneled with fake wood grain that was peeling in several places. Everything smelled of stale cigarettes, motor oil, and something else Chester couldn't quite identify, something organic and unpleasant. Behind the counter sat a woman who looked to be in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a face that suggested she'd seen more than her share of hard times. She wore a faded uniform shirt with a name tag that read Gladys, and when she looked up at Chester, her smile seemed forced and unnatural. "Help you, hun?" Gladys asked, her voice carrying the thick accent of deep Appalachia. "Just looking for some coffee," Chester replied, walking toward the back of the store where he could see a coffee station set up, and maybe something to eat. "Coffee's fresh," Gladys said, though the pot looked like it had been sitting there for hours. "Got some sandwiches in the cooler if you're hungry." Chester poured himself a cup of coffee and grabbed a pre-made sandwich from the refrigerated case. The sandwich looked questionable, but he was too hungry to be choosy. He brought his purchases to the counter and noticed that Gladys was studying him with unusual intensity. "You staying the night?" she asked as she rang up his items. "Just for a few hours," Chester replied. "Got to get some sleep before I push on to Atlanta." Gladys nodded and continued staring at him in a way that made Chester uncomfortable. "Don't get many drivers stopping here anymore," she said. "Most of them go to that big truck stop down in Cookville, but this here's a much nicer place to rest up." Chester paid for his items and started to leave, but Gladys's voice stopped him. "You be careful out there tonight, hon. Sometimes we get some strange folks wandering around the parking lot after dark." Chester thanked her for the warning and headed back to his truck, but something about the whole interaction had left him feeling uneasy. There was something in Gladys's manner that suggested she knew more than she was saying about these strange folks. Back at his truck, Chester settled into his sleeper berth with his coffee and sandwich. The sandwich tasted as bad as it looked, but the coffee was drinkable. He tried to relax and get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Maybe it was the caffeine, or maybe it was the strange atmosphere of this isolated truck stop. Chester had been lying there for about an hour when he heard voices outside. At first, he thought it might be other drivers arriving, but as he listened more carefully, he realized the voices were coming from somewhere near the main building, and they didn't sound like normal conversation. Chester got up and peered out his sleeper berth window. In the dim light from the building, he could see 3 figures standing near the entrance to the truck stop. They were too far away for him to make out details, but something about their posture and movement suggested they weren't customers. One of the figures separated from the group and began walking across the parking lot toward the trucks. Chester ducked down below the window, not wanting to be seen watching. Through the thin walls of his sleeper berth, he could hear footsteps approaching on the gravel. The footsteps stopped somewhere near Chester's truck, and he could hear someone moving around outside. It sounded like they were examining his rig, maybe checking the doors or looking at the license plates. Chester held his breath and tried to remain perfectly still. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. Chester waited several more minutes before carefully peering out the window again. The figure was walking back toward the main building, where the other 2 were still waiting. Chester tried to convince himself that it was nothing. Maybe they were just security guards or maintenance workers, but something about their behavior suggested otherwise. Normal security guards didn't skulk around in the darkness examining parked trucks. Chester was just starting to relax when he heard a new sound, the rumble of another truck pulling into the parking lot. He looked out the window to see a large rig backing into a spot, several spaces away from his own truck. The new arrival shut off his engine and climbed down from his cab. That's when Chester got his first clear look at one of the mysterious figures. As the new driver walked toward the main building, one of the 3 watchers stepped out of the shadows to intercept him. In the weak light, Chester could see that it was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing what looked like work clothes. Chester couldn't hear what was said, but the conversation appeared to be friendly. The driver and the stranger talked for several minutes before both of them walked toward the truck stop building together. They disappeared inside, leaving the other 2 figures lurking in the darkness. Chester was now thoroughly awake and alert. Something was definitely wrong with this situation. Normal truck stops didn't have people hanging around in the parking lot at night, intercepting drivers and having mysterious conversations. Chester decided he needed to get a better look at what was going on. He quietly opened his sleeper berth curtain and crawled into the driver's seat of his truck. From there, he had a better view of the parking lot and the main building. Through the windows of the truck stop, Chester could see the new driver sitting at a table with 2 men. One of them was the figure who had intercepted him in the parking lot, and the other was someone Chester hadn't seen before. They appeared to be having an intense conversation, but Chester couldn't make out any details from his position. That's when Chester noticed something that made his blood run cold. The two remaining figures in the parking lot were no longer standing near the main building. They had moved closer to the parked trucks, and one of them was now positioned near the new driver's rig. Chester watched in growing alarm as this figure produced what looked like a small tool and began working on something underneath the new driver's truck. It was hard to see exactly what he was doing in the dim light, but it looked like he was tampering with the vehicle. Chester grabbed his cell phone to call the police, but the screen showed no signal bars. He wasn't surprised. These remote mountain areas often had poor cellular coverage, but that meant he was on his own in whatever was happening here. Chester tried to think of his options. He could start his truck and try to leave, but that would make noise and draw attention to himself. He could try to warn the other driver, but that would mean leaving the safety of his cab and exposing himself to whatever these people were planning. While Chester was trying to decide what to do, the situation in the truck stop building began to escalate. Through the windows, he could see that the conversation at the table was becoming more heated. The new driver appeared to be trying to leave, but the two men were blocking his path. Suddenly, one of the men grabbed the driver and forced him back into his chair. Chester could see the driver struggling, but he was clearly outnumbered and outmatched. The second man produced something from his pocket. Chester couldn't see what it was, but the driver immediately stopped struggling. Chester realized he was witnessing some kind of robbery or worse. These people had set up an operation at this isolated truck stop to prey on lone drivers who stopped here overnight, and Chester had walked right into their trap. The man who had been tampering with the truck in the parking lot finished whatever he was doing and jogged back toward the main building. Through the windows, Chester could see him enter the building and join the others at the table. Now, all three of the strangers were focused on the captured driver, which meant Chester might have a chance to escape. But he couldn't just leave another driver to whatever fate these criminals had planned. He had to do something. Chester quietly opened his truck door and climbed down to the ground. Moving as stealthily as possible, he made his way across the parking lot toward the main building. If he could get close enough to one of the windows, maybe he could see what was happening inside and figure out how to help. As Chester crept closer to the building, he could hear voices through the thin walls. The conversation was muffled, but he could make out enough to understand that the criminals were demanding money and cargo information from the captured driver. "Just tell us what you're hauling and where you're going," one voice was saying. "Make this easy on yourself." "I already told you," came the driver's voice, strained with fear. "It's just auto parts, nothing valuable." "Don't lie to us," another voice said. "We know you drivers sometimes carry cash, jewelry, other valuable stuff. Where do you keep it?" Chester realized these weren't just random robbers. They had set up a systematic operation to intercept and rob truck drivers. The isolated location, the friendly approach, the tampering with vehicles, it was all designed to trap drivers and make them easy targets. Chester worked his way around the building, looking for a back entrance or a window that might give him a better vantage point. That's when he heard footsteps behind him. "Well, well," a voice said. "Looks like we got ourselves another customer." Chester spun around to see a man emerging from the shadows. He was tall and lean, with long hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. In his hand, he carried what looked like a crowbar. "Name's Virgil," the man said with a grin that showed several missing teeth. "You must be the driver in that Peterbilt. Been wondering when you'd decide to join the party." Chester's heart was pounding, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "I was just looking for the restroom." Virgil laughed. "Restrooms inside, friend. Right where my associates are having a chat with your buddy. Why don't you come on in and join them?" Chester knew he had no choice. If he tried to run, Virgil would probably catch him before he made it back to his truck. And even if he did escape, he'd be leaving the other driver to face whatever these criminals had planned. Virgil gestured toward the front of the building with his crowbar. "After you." Chester walked slowly toward the entrance, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out of this situation. Inside the building, he could see that the other driver was now tied to his chair with what looked like rope or duct tape. As they entered the building, Gladys looked up from behind the counter with that same forced smile she'd worn earlier. "Well, hello again, hun. Having trouble sleeping?" "You could say that," Chester replied, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. The two men at the table looked up as Virgil brought Chester over. One of them was middle-aged and heavy-set, with the kind of build that suggested he'd done hard physical labor his whole life. The other was younger and thinner, with nervous eyes that darted constantly around the room. "This the other driver?" the heavy-set man asked. "Yep," Virgil replied. "Found him skulking around outside." The heavy-set man stood up and approached Chester. "I'm going to make this simple for you, friend. We're in the business of collecting road taxes from drivers who use our mountain roads. You pay the tax, you get to continue your journey. You don't pay, well, things get complicated." "How much?" Chester asked, though he was pretty sure this wasn't really about money. "Depends on what you're carrying," the man replied. "Why don't you tell us about your load?" Chester considered his options. He could lie about his cargo, but these people probably had ways of finding out the truth. He could try to fight, but he was outnumbered 4-1. Or he could play along and hope for an opportunity to escape. "Auto parts," Chester said, headed for Atlanta. "Auto parts," the man repeated. "That's interesting. Your friend here says he's carrying auto parts too. What are the odds of that?" Chester realized his mistake too late. By giving the same answer as the other driver, he'd made it obvious that they had rehearsed their stories, or that they were both lying. The man's expression hardened. "You boys think we're stupid? Nobody carries auto parts on the same route at the same time unless they're running together. So, what's the real story?" Before Chester could answer, the younger man spoke up. "Maybe we should just take what we can and be done with it. This is taking too long." "Shut up," the heavy-set man snapped. "We do this right or we don't do it at all." Chester began to understand that this wasn't just a simple robbery. These people had a system, a method for extracting maximum value from their victims. And they weren't in any hurry. "Here's what's going to happen," the man continued. "You're going to give us the keys to your trucks, tell us exactly what you're carrying, and provide us with your delivery information. Then you're going to sit quietly while we decide what to do with you." "And if we refuse?" the other driver asked. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say that these mountains are full of places where a body might never be found." The threat was clear enough. Chester and the other driver were completely at the mercy of these criminals, and the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. That's when Chester heard something that gave him a glimmer of hope. The distant sound of a truck engine approaching on the access road. Another driver was coming to the truck stop, which meant these criminals would have to deal with a new variable in their carefully controlled situation. The heavy-set man had heard it too. He cursed under his breath and gestured to Virgil. "Go see who that is. If it's another driver, bring him in. If it's anybody else, get rid of them." Virgil headed for the door, but as he reached for the handle, the sound of the approaching truck engine suddenly became much louder, and it was accompanied by another sound that made Chester's heart leap. Sirens. "That's the cops!" the younger man shouted, jumping up from his chair. The heavy-set man's face went pale. "How the hell did they find us?" Chester didn't know the answer to that question, but he wasn't going to waste this opportunity. As the criminals scrambled to figure out what to do, Chester lunged toward the table where the other driver was tied up. "Run!" Chester shouted as he worked frantically at the ropes holding the other driver. "Get out of here!" The truck stop erupted into chaos as the criminals tried to decide whether to fight or flee. Gladys had disappeared behind the counter, and the younger man was heading for what looked like a back exit. Only the heavyset man seemed determined to maintain control of the situation. "Nobody's going anywhere," he shouted, producing a pistol from somewhere under his jacket. But it was too late. The front door burst open, and state police officers poured into the building, weapons drawn and shouting commands. Within seconds, the criminals were on the ground in handcuffs, and Chester found himself face to face with a state trooper who looked almost as surprised as he was. "Are you all right, sir?" the trooper asked. "Are you injured?" "I'm fine," Chester replied, still trying to process what had just happened. "But how did you know we were here?" The trooper smiled grimly. "We've been watching this place for weeks. Got a tip that there was some kind of criminal operation going on here. Tonight, we decided to move in and see what we could find." As the police sorted out the situation, Chester learned that Mountain View Truck Plaza had been the subject of an ongoing investigation. Several truck drivers had reported suspicious activity in the area, and at least 2 drivers had gone missing after being seen at this truck stop. The criminals had been running their operation for months, systematically robbing drivers, and, in some cases, making them disappear entirely. Chester and the other driver had walked into a trap that had already claimed several victims. The criminals, it turned out, had been using the isolated truck stop as a base of operations for a variety of illegal activities. In addition to robbing drivers, they had been involved in cargo theft, insurance fraud, and human trafficking. The truck stop itself was owned by a shell company that was connected to organized crime figures in 3 states. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of their operation. Gladys, whose real name was Gladys Carpenter, had been the inside person at the truck stop, identifying potential targets and signaling the criminal crew when suitable victims arrived. Virgil and his associates would then approach the drivers under the pretense of being helpful locals or security guards. Once they had gained the drivers' trust, they would rob them of cash and valuable cargo. But some drivers who proved uncooperative or who might be able to identify the criminals were simply made to disappear. Their trucks would be driven to remote locations and stripped for parts, while the drivers themselves were never seen again. Chester and the other driver had been incredibly lucky. If the police hadn't chosen that particular night to raid the truck stop, they might well have become the latest victims of this organized criminal enterprise. As Chester gave his statement to the investigators, he couldn't help but think about how many other truck stops might be hiding similar operations. The isolation of mountain roads made them perfect hunting grounds for predators who viewed truckers as easy targets. The experience left Chester with a new appreciation for the dangers that truck drivers faced on remote roads. He'd always known that trucking could be dangerous, but he'd thought the dangers came from mechanical failures, bad weather, and careless drivers. He'd never imagined that there were organized criminal groups specifically targeting truckers. Chester testified at the trials of Gladys, Virgil, and their associates. All of them received lengthy prison sentences for their crimes, but Chester knew that there were probably dozens of similar operations running in remote areas across the country. The truck stop was eventually closed permanently and the building was demolished. But Chester never forgot the lesson he'd learned that night. He never again stopped at an unfamiliar truck stop without doing research first, and he made sure other drivers knew about the dangers lurking in places like Mountain View Truck Plaza. Chester continued driving for several more years before finally retiring and opening a small garage in his hometown. But he never forgot that night in the Tennessee mountains when he'd come face to face with predators who hunted truckers for sport. He would often tell the story to younger drivers, warning them about the dangers of isolated truck stops and remote mountain roads. Because in the dark hollows of Appalachia, there were people who viewed truck drivers not as human beings trying to make a living, but as prey to be hunted and exploited. The mountains themselves were beautiful and peaceful, but they could also hide terrible secrets. And sometimes the greatest danger came not from the roads or the weather, but from the people who lived in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to wander into their web. Chester's experience at Mountain View Truck Plaza became something of a legend among truckers who ran routes through the Southeast. Drivers would share the story at truck stops and loading docks, using it as a cautionary tale about the importance of staying alert and trusting your instincts. Because in a profession where drivers often found themselves alone on dark roads in the middle of nowhere, the difference between life and death could come down to recognizing danger before it was too late. The investigation into the Mountain View Truck Plaza operation eventually led to the discovery of similar criminal enterprises in 4 other states. Law enforcement agencies began working together to identify and shut down these predatory operations, but they knew it was an ongoing battle. For every criminal truck stop that was closed, there were probably 2 more operating in remote areas where law enforcement presence was minimal. The vast network of highways and truck stops that kept America's economy moving also provided perfect cover for those who preyed on the men and women who drove those roads. Chester's story served as a reminder that in the trucking industry, vigilance was not just good business practice, it was a matter of survival. The mountains of Appalachia would always be dangerous for truckers, not just because of the steep grades and winding roads, but because of the human predators who lurked in their shadows. And somewhere in those ancient hills, there were still truck stops and rest areas where the people who offered help were the ones drivers should fear the most. Because the mountains had been home to outlaws and predators for generations, and modern highways had simply given them new hunting grounds and new prey. But Chester's story didn't end with the arrests at Mountain View Truck Plaza. 3 months after the trials, when the media attention had died down and life had returned to normal, Chester received a phone call that would bring all his nightmares rushing back. It was a Tuesday evening in late February when Chester's phone rang. He was at home, watching television with his wife Sarah, enjoying a rare night off from his driving schedule. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Tennessee number, and Chester almost didn't answer it. Chester Dunmore? The voice on the other end was gruff and unfamiliar. "Yeah, this is Chester. Who's this?" "My name's Detective Reynolds, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. I need to talk to you about Mountain View Truck Plaza." Chester felt a chill run down his spine. "I thought that case was closed. All those people got convicted. It was closed. But something's come up. Something that suggests we didn't get everybody involved in that operation." Reynolds explained that they'd been monitoring communications from the prison where Virgil and his associates were serving their sentences. Recent intercepted phone calls suggested that there were other members of the criminal organization still at large, people who were planning to resume operations at a new location. "We think they're targeting drivers who testified against their friends," Reynolds said. "Drivers like you, Mr. Dunmore." Chester's blood ran cold. The idea that he might still be in danger, months after the arrests, had never occurred to him. "What kind of targeting?" "We're not sure yet. Could be intimidation, could be worse, but we've picked up chatter about evening the score with witnesses who helped put their people away." Reynolds wanted Chester to come to Tennessee for a briefing about the ongoing investigation. He assured Chester that they would provide protection, but he made it clear that the threat was serious enough to warrant federal involvement. Chester hung up the phone and tried to process what he'd just learned. He'd thought his nightmare was over, but apparently it was just beginning. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, and when he explained the situation, she immediately insisted that they contact the FBI. "These people tried to kill you once," she said. "We're not taking any chances with your safety." But Chester had deliveries to make, bills to pay, and a reputation to maintain. He couldn't just disappear into witness protection because of some vague threats from convicted criminals. After much discussion, Chester decided to continue working, but to take extra precautions. He started varying his routes, avoiding the southeastern states where the Mountain View operation had been based. He began carrying a pistol, despite having no formal training with firearms, and he installed a GPS tracking system in his truck that would alert authorities if his vehicle stopped moving for an extended period. For several weeks, nothing happened. Chester began to think that maybe the investigators were being overly cautious, that the prison conversations they'd intercepted were just idle threats from angry criminals. But then came the night that proved him wrong. Chester was driving through Virginia, hauling a load of electronic components to a distribution center in Richmond. It was a route he'd driven dozens of times, and he knew every truck stop and rest area along the way. He was making good time and feeling confident about his safety precautions. That's when he noticed the pickup truck in his mirrors. It had appeared about 50 miles back, maintaining a steady distance behind Chester's rig. At first, Chester didn't think much of it. Pickup trucks were common on Virginia highways, but as the miles passed, the truck stayed exactly the same distance behind him, matching his speed changes and lane changes with suspicious precision. Chester tried a test. He slowed down by 5 miles per hour, and the pickup truck immediately did the same. He sped up by 10 miles per hour, and again the truck matched his speed exactly. There was no doubt about it. He was being followed. Chester reached for his CB radio and tried to raise other drivers on Channel 19. "Eastbound I-64. Anybody out there see a dark pickup truck that's been tailing me for the last hour?" A voice immediately responded, "Yeah, I see him. Been wondering about that myself. Truck's been staying awful close to your rear end. You think he's just road raging? Or is this something more serious? Hard to say, driver. But if I was you, I'd find myself a place with lots of people and lights. That truck's got Tennessee plates, and the driver's wearing a baseball cap pulled down low over his face. Tennessee plates." Chester's heart started pounding as he remembered Detective Reynolds' warning about revenge from the Mountain View criminals. This wasn't road rage. This was something much more dangerous. Chester looked ahead for the next exit with services. According to his GPS, there was a truck stop about 10 miles ahead, a well-lit facility with 24-hour security. If he could make it there, he might be able to lose his tail, or at least get help from other drivers. But as Chester approached the exit, something went wrong. The pickup truck suddenly accelerated and pulled alongside Chester's trailer. Through his passenger window, Chester could see the driver, a lean man with long hair and a beard who looked disturbingly familiar. It was one of the men from Mountain View Truck Plaza. Not Virgil or any of the ones who had been arrested, but someone who had been lurking in the background that night. Someone the police had missed. The pickup truck swerved toward Chester's trailer, trying to force him off the road. Chester fought with his steering wheel, struggling to keep his 18-wheeler under control as the pickup truck repeatedly rammed into his trailer. Sparks flew as metal scraped against metal, and Chester could feel his trailer starting to fishtail. Chester grabbed his cell phone and dialed 911, but before he could complete the call, the pickup truck made another aggressive move. This time, the driver managed to get in front of Chester's truck and began hitting his brakes, trying to force Chester into a rear-end collision. Chester had no choice but to use his truck's superior size and weight to his advantage. He downshifted and accelerated, pushing the pickup truck forward with the front bumper of his Peterbilt. The pickup's driver fought to maintain control, but Chester's truck was simply too powerful. For several terrifying minutes, the two vehicles were locked together, speeding down the interstate at 70 miles per hour in a deadly game of automotive warfare. Other drivers were swerving to avoid them, and Chester could see cars pulling onto the shoulder to escape the chaos. Finally, Chester saw his chance. As they approached a steep downgrade, he let off the accelerator and allowed the pickup truck to pull ahead. Then, as the pickup's driver tried to get back alongside his trailer, Chester made a sudden lane change to the right, cutting the pickup truck off and forcing it onto the shoulder. The pickup truck lost control on the gravel shoulder and went into a violent spin. Chester watched in his mirrors as it rolled over several times before coming to rest upside down in a ditch beside the highway. Chester pulled over at the next exit and called 911, reporting the accident and explaining that he'd been the victim of an attempted assault. When the state police arrived, they found the pickup truck's driver unconscious but alive, trapped in his overturned vehicle. A search of the pickup truck revealed weapons, surveillance equipment, and detailed information about Chester's driving routes and schedule. The driver, when he regained consciousness, turned out to be Danny Carpenter, Gladys's nephew, who had been part of the Mountain View operation but had escaped arrest that night. Danny had been tracking Chester for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity to exact revenge for his aunt's imprisonment. He'd been planning to force Chester's truck off the road in a remote area, then make him disappear just like the other drivers who had crossed the Mountain View organization. The arrest of Danny Carpenter led to the discovery of two other Mountain View associates, who had been planning similar attacks on other witnesses. Federal marshals were assigned to protect Chester and the other drivers who had testified, and a new investigation was launched into the full extent of the criminal network. But for Chester, the psychological damage was already done. The knowledge that there were people out there who wanted him dead, people who were willing to hunt him down on the highways where he made his living, was almost too much to bear. Chester started having nightmares about being chased by pickup trucks with Tennessee plates. He became paranoid about every vehicle that stayed behind him for more than a few minutes. His driving became erratic as he constantly checked his mirrors and changed routes to avoid potential threats. Sarah begged him to quit driving and find a safer job, but Chester couldn't afford to stop working. Trucking was all he knew, and at 45 years old, he wasn't sure he could start over in a new career. But the stress was taking a toll on his health and his marriage. The final straw came 6 months later, when Chester was making a delivery in North Carolina, and noticed a suspicious van following him through several small towns. This time, it turned out to be nothing, just a coincidence involving a lost driver who happened to be going the same direction. But Chester's reaction was so extreme that other drivers called the police, thinking he was having some kind of breakdown. That incident convinced Chester that he needed to make a change. With Sarah's support, he applied for early retirement from his trucking company and used his savings to open a small auto repair garage in their hometown. It wasn't the retirement he'd planned, but it allowed him to work with trucks and machinery while staying close to home and avoiding the highways where his nightmares lived. Even years later, Chester would sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming about Mountain View Truck Plaza and the predators who had hunted him. The garage was successful, and he enjoyed mentoring young mechanics and sharing his knowledge of truck maintenance. But he never forgot the lesson he'd learned about the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of seemingly innocent places. Chester's story became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the trucking community, a reminder that the dangers drivers faced weren't always obvious or predictable. Sometimes the greatest threat came not from the road itself, but from the people who used the road as a hunting ground. The Mountain View Truck Plaza building was eventually demolished, but its legacy lived on in the stories that drivers told each other. Stories about the importance of trusting your instincts, staying alert in unfamiliar places, and never underestimating the evil that ordinary-looking people could harbor. And somewhere in the mountains of Tennessee, there were probably still predators waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to stop at the wrong place at the wrong time. Because the highways of America were vast and largely unmonitored, providing perfect cover for those who viewed truck drivers not as hardworking professionals, but as prey to be hunted and destroyed. Chester's garage became a gathering place for retired drivers who shared similar stories of close calls and narrow escapes. They would sit around the waiting area, drinking coffee and swapping tales of the dangers they'd faced on the road. Each story was different, but they all shared common themes: isolation, vulnerability, and the constant awareness that death could be waiting around the next curve. The mountains of Appalachia remained beautiful and mysterious, drawing tourists and travelers from around the world. But for those who knew their secrets, those ancient hills would always be places of danger and darkness, where the law of the jungle still applied and the strong preyed upon the weak. Chester never regretted his decision to testify against the Mountain View criminals, but he often wondered how many other drivers had encountered similar predators and never lived to tell about it. The highways were full of missing persons cases that were never solved, trucks that were found abandoned with no trace of their drivers. Some of those disappearances were probably accidents or suicides or voluntary disappearances, but others, Chester suspected, were the work of predators like those who had operated at Mountain View Truck Plaza. People who had learned to use the isolation and vulnerability of truck drivers to their advantage. The trucking industry had made efforts to improve safety and security for drivers, but the basic reality remained unchanged. Millions of miles of highway, thousands of remote truck stops and rest areas, and drivers who often traveled alone through areas where help was hours away. For predators who understood how to exploit those vulnerabilities, the American highway system was like a vast hunting preserve, where prey was plentiful and law enforcement was spread thin. And for drivers like Chester, who had seen the darkness firsthand, every trip was a journey through potentially hostile territory, where vigilance was the only protection. But the trucks still rolled, and the drivers still drove, because the country needed its freight delivered, and there were still good people willing to take the risks. They just did it with a little more caution, a little more awareness, and a lot more respect for the dangers that lurked in the shadows of America's highways. Chester's garage thrived, and he eventually trained 3 young mechanics who carried on his tradition of excellence in truck maintenance. But he never stopped telling the story of Mountain View Truck Plaza, because he knew that somewhere out there, another trucker was pulling into another isolated truck stop, trusting that the people who offered help were what they seemed to be. And Chester hoped that his story might save at least one driver from making the same mistake he had made that night in the Tennessee mountains, when he had trusted his safety to strangers who saw him not as a human being in need of help, but as prey to be hunted and destroyed.